very honoured to have an international award-winning British film director amongst us. Can please give a big hand to Ken Loach up on the stage.
Very much. And thanks for letting me say a couple of words. First of all, I want to say congratulations to the people who have organised this. It's a magnificent demonstration of solidarity and refusal to accept the situation of our governments and the Western governments of supporting this appalling crimes that people have spoken about. The horrors we have seen over the last year on our screens every day are beyond anything any of us could ever have imagined. They are worse than anything we have seen or heard of since the last Second World War. They are extraordinary in their horror. The mass slaughter, the starvation, the seeing families pushed to and fro across the Gaza Strip, told they have to move, shot as they move, no safe place to go, back they go to the same place again, back into the other place again, and every time they're in greater danger, every time they lose family members. And now the ultimate horror, as the last speaker said, the UN spokesman this morning saying this is the very darkest time in this very dark year, where people are defenseless, waiting to be slaughtered by the bombs from Israel. And over that year, I'm sure there are images that stay in your mind as they do in mine. Just random images. I mean, I remember a girl, aged about 11, lying on a hospital bed, her eyes bandaged round her eyes, sobbing, because all her members of her family had been killed, her mother, her father, her sisters, brothers, and she was in a world knowing no one, and she would never see that world again. I remember a little boy, aged 5 or 6, on the floor, clutching a football to his chest, blankly staring into the middle distance. And then the camera panned down, and one of his legs was a stump wrapped in a white sheet, bleeding. Images that stay in your mind, forever, really. And then, of course, as has been, as the last speaker or another speaker said correctly, the terrible fire that engulfs people in the north of Gaza just recently. And the images were there on our screens. Fire, and within that you could see the bodies, people with their clothes blazing, no hope, and some bodies were much shorter than others, and they were children, burned alive in front of our eyes. You cannot do these things and not know what you're doing. This is conscious cruelty. And I want to make 2 points that we sometimes forget, although again the speaker has reminded us today. The first one is that the number of deaths, as the Lancet article said, of the indirect deaths are 3 to 15 times the amount of direct deaths. That is, hundreds of thousands of people have died. Tens of thousands, probably 100,000 children or more have died. And then add on many multiples of that for the wounded, the maimed, the blinded. This is extraordinary carnage of an innocent people done by one of the most powerful armies in the world, backed by our contemptible government and America. Shame on them indeed. And the other thing I want us to remember is that the judgment of I believe it was the International Court of Justice, it might have been the International Criminal Court, it was a UN court that said that
from 1967, the occupation itself is illegal. Israel has no legal right to be in Palestinian territories. The settlements are illegal. The settlements should be removed.
Yes.
Their very presence is illegal. Never mind the massacres. From 1967, Israel has been acting illegally, and yet they have received massive support in their illegality from the Western countries. We happen to have a Prime Minister who is an expert in international law. He's made his reputation with defending human rights. How lucky are we? Well, not quite as lucky as we thought, because it turns out he doesn't give a toss for international law. That man has revealed himself from the moment he's put himself forward to be Labour leader, that he will say whatever he thinks will get him advantage. He will say whatever he thinks will win him some advance.
Snake oil.
And it's revealed he changed with his commitments to become Labour leader suddenly disappeared when he got it. And now, of course, he's a version of a Tory. I have a good friend of mine, the writer Paul Laverty, quotes an old African proverb. And I think of this proverb when I think of Keir Starmer. And the proverb says, "The higher the monkey climbs the tree, the more you see his arse." But the other point I want to make is the dehumanizing of the Palestinians by the Israelis and by those who support them. The dehumanizing, because you can't do this to someone you see as a fellow human being. And remember the Israeli politician right at the outset called the Palestinian animals. And there are two examples of this. There are many, of course, but two stick in my mind. One is, and I don't know if you remember this just recently, in Lebanon, the handheld telephones were primed to explode at the same point in time in many thousands. So young soldiers, young people who carried these phones would suddenly have them and they would explode. And you have just think of the skill in planning that. And a surgeon said, when he saw the injuries, he said, "My first job was to take out 2 eyes. That was my first job. The second was to try to reconstruct the face." These young men and young women too have lost their noses, their ears, their lips. They had no face. Their features had gone. And of course there was a wait because all the phones went off at the same time. Therefore the hospitals were overwhelmed. So somebody with these injuries were waiting and waiting and waiting to be treated. Now just think, somebody planned that. Somebody knew that would happen. Somebody knew they were going to blind thousands of young people. They knew that their faces would be destroyed. They knew they would lose the fingers off their hand. And yet the skill, the science, the organization, the number of people involved, the planning meetings, the extraordinary skill, organization, scientific knowledge to plan that destruction, even for your enemy, is so contemptible. It is so contemptible. And yet they did it. You cannot do that to a fellow human being. You can only do it to people for who you think are inferior. This is racism. Yeah. This is racism. And it's started. And the other thing that shows the dehumanization is something that's been referred to already, is the gathering of people on on a hilltop watching the bombing in Gaza. And there was one man interviewed, it was on Channel 4, I believe, where he said, well, the Palestinians can go to America, the Palestinians can go to Britain, the people will welcome them there. They want that land from the very beginning, from the founding of Israel. The project was the Greater Israel, and that is their plan. And you know the worst image from that gathering on the hillside were young women using children's toys to blow bubbles. They were blowing bubbles to celebrate the killing that they saw in front of their eyes. I mean, words fail you, don't they? When you think of the mindset of people who can do that, words fail you. But I want to end really by talking about our demands, because I think we need to start thinking and putting on the public agenda the demands that justice says we need. And I made a list. I might have to refer to it. Memory's crap these days. I mean, obviously, an immediate and permanent ceasefire. At some point, God knows when it will happen. First of all, we must support the United Nations. The United Nations has, weak though it is, has said the right things from time to time. It is calling out the genocide led by South Africa, and it is calling out the war crimes, and it has sent in the aid agencies and exposed Israel when the aid agencies cannot function. And that is the international body. They have condemned Israel. They must have the authority to impose justice on the situation. Following that, we must demand the rule of law and the universality of human rights. If we do that, then international law demands Israel is removed from all Palestinian land. That's implicit. Further, I don't know if you're listening to the discussions about what happens the day after. You get them on the BBC, you get them on the news media, I guess you get them in the press. They're deciding whether Israel will agree to the settlement. Israel has nothing to do with the settlement. The settlement is the right of the Palestinian people. They have the right to democracy. They have the right to choose their own future. And that, the Palestinians are the only people who can decide the future of Palestine. So the Palestinian future must be in the hands of Palestinians and Palestinians alone, and the UN must enforce it. The next demand is the war criminals must face justice. They must face justice. Israel has killed by assassinating the leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah. But the war criminals, all of them, and that includes the Israeli government, the Israeli generals, they must face war crimes and they must face the punishment. They must face the punishment. I'm old enough to remember the Nuremberg trials, and I know what that means, and that must apply to them. And finally, Israel must pay reparations to all the Palestinian people. They must pay for the reconstruction. They must pay for the medical damage they've done. They must pay, because it is a crime that, like no other, that I can remember in my lifetime since the Second World War. Anyway, time to go. Solidarity, comrades. We'll win.